Hello, and welcome to the Megan Taylor Creative Podcast, a show for entrepreneurs looking to grow their business with digital marketing. In this episode, I'll be sharing my top tips on how you can start your very own marketing podcast. Let's get started. So, in this episode of the Megan Taylor Creative Podcast, I just wanted to take a little bit of a break from talking specifically about content marketing and content marketing strategy, which is mostly what I do here on the podcast and also in my business as well. And I actually wanted to sit down and share with you how I started this podcast because I've got quite a few tips on how to do it, and I've had quite a few people on social media show interest in me talking about this because it's very much a DIY podcast. I'm recording this in my living room and I don't have any fancy microphone equipment, so I thought it would be interesting to share how someone who is literally starting a bedroom type business that wants to start a podcast but feels intimidated to do so because they don't feel like they have the right equipment. And I can tell you through my experience that you can start a podcast and you can start one at home with just your phone, or better yet, with your laptop, and a laptop that specifically has a built-in microphone. And I'm going to talk about a few things like how to actually get started and share with you a couple of troubleshooting tips because I've had a few kind of growing pains recently, especially with like my sound. You may have noticed in the past couple of episodes, probably didn't, but I'm drawing attention to it. You may have noticed that the sound was a little bit muffled, and I'm not quite sure what that is. I actually think that might just be to do with the built-in microphone, because for the past however many episodes I've been using the exact same setup, and I'm just wondering if it's because the laptop is deteriorating or if I just need to get like a clip-on microphone or something. So I'll be talking about how I troubleshooted those tips and what I used to make sure that the sound is as clear as it can be and things like that. So yeah, if that sounds interesting to you, I hope you enjoy the rest of the episode. And as always, let's just get straight into it. So the first tip that I have for you to actually start your podcast is to come up with a name and your branding. And I think that this is a really important first step because depending on the show and the type of format that your podcast has, you're going to want to start marketing early, and it's a good idea to already have a strong, captivating brand. And this comes into play if you're going to be interviewing any guests, because you're going to want to advertise that you're looking for guests on your various social media platforms, and having a strong brand that will appeal to your ideal guests in the way that your kind of business brand would appeal to your target audience is really important. But it's also good even for solo shows like myself. I started advertising that I was going to be doing a podcast relatively early on, and that's really helped build some momentum behind it. And I already had a small but kind of engaged following on social media, so that really helped too. And I could start showing things like the podcast art and first episode. And I just think it's really important to, if you're going to take it seriously, to kind of have something concrete, because so many people actually want to start a podcast, but if you don't have a name or a brand, it can be hard to feel motivated to actually executing that. And that leads me nicely onto my next tip. So now that you've come up with a brand, which should include things like the title of your podcast and the brand colors and things like that, let's actually look at the next steps that you need to take. And there's two steps here, in my personal opinion. And the first is to choose a podcast topic that you want your podcast to specialize in. And the second is to come up with a list of episodes. I think you should do this before you start recording at all. Some podcast shows are very much stream of consciousness, where the person comes on and they just kind of talk about whatever it is that is going on in their mind relating to the topic that they've chosen. But I think that it's good to have a list of topics that you can refer back to, because you will have weeks where you'll need to get a podcast episode up and you won't be sure of what to actually talk about. This happened to me this week, which is why I thought actually making a podcast about starting a podcast would be be quite an interesting thing to do. And there's so much that I could talk about it because I've got that experience. And I've also helped other podcasts as well, specifically when I was working in a corporate setting. So I've had that experience, and also with my ethic journalism experience. I remember we did like a lot of Vox Pop things, and I think I helped a friend of mine at the time record a podcast. And we were really lucky at the university because they had like a whole suite of podcast ready studios that you could use either just to record music or to record a podcast. And we used it to record a podcast. There were like 3 really good quality microphones, and you have the mixing desks and stuff like that. So that was really kind of high quality and really fun. I also helped a friend do a radio show for a while. So I've kind of had a little bit of background in audio, but it's never really been something that I took seriously until this year. And generating a list of topics and a topic that I actually wanted to talk about made the idea of starting a podcast a lot less intimidating, because I could already start to envision what I would say when it came time to actually record the first couple of episodes. And I think that's why this is so important. So many people don't start their dream podcast because they're intimidated by the idea of just talking into a microphone, into open space to themselves. And I'm still intimidated by it to some degree. I'm quite a shy person to some extent, and the idea of saying whatever comes to mind makes me quite self-conscious. But in doing the podcast, I've noticed that I've become a lot more confident over time, and it's become a lot easier to express how I'm feeling in a short space of time in a specific moment, whereas before I would maybe struggle to comprise my thoughts in business settings. For example, the early days of my career, I would really struggle in like business meetings and sitting down with stakeholders and things like that, because it's not really something that I'd had that much experience about, being able to kind of communicate exactly what was on my mind. I felt like I really needed to plan exactly what I was going to say, and I don't feel like I need to do that with this podcast. I've just got a list of topic ideas that I can talk about, and then I can come up with a few notes, break down those specific topics so that I have an idea of what I want to say, and I can kind of structure the episode. But other than that, I can now come onto this podcast and basically talk stream of consciousness, which is exactly what I'm doing now. But you don't get that unless you start actually doing these 2 things. Really helps make starting that podcast less intimidating and more of a reality. So in choosing your topics, so the actual topics that you'll be covering each week and the main content pillars that you'll be touching upon, you also need to consider the actual content format. So content format is quite important when it comes to podcasts, and there's a lot of different types of formats that you can follow. But my personal favorite, and this is why I decided to take this route, is just kind of the solopreneur. Let's just talk about a topic and see what kind of comes to mind, because I find that it's the most natural type of podcast. I like interview podcasts as well, but I find that sometimes the interviews can be a little bit awkward, or there's more of the podcast host speaking than there is the interviewer speaking, and you don't feel like you're getting the full experience. I find that some shows do it really well. So, for example, Diary of a CEO, that's a really good one to listen to. I can't remember what his name is. Stephen Bartlett. That's the guy that does the Diary of a CEO podcast, and he's amazing. Like, he's an ex-marketing person, and he worked for like a really big agency who I think have like headquarters in Berlin and London and things like that. And he now does this podcast, and it's a really popular podcast that a lot of celebrities go on. So I know that most of us aren't going to be able to aspire to get celebrities on. Like, I'm just looking at his list now, and the latest episode is him talking to Stephen Fry, and he's also got Louis Theroux as well. So people like that are really interesting and have had really fascinating careers. But you can find people who have really interesting and fascinating careers. If you want to have an interview style podcast, without approaching celebrities. There's so many people that have just done so many unique things, and social media is the perfect place to go and find that and seek that. I also find, I'm not quite sure what the official term is for it, but there's more of like a radio style podcast where it's going to be kind of broken down very specifically and it's going to be very planned and you're going to have different segments and things like that. And that's not really what I do, but it is something that I'm considering doing in the future, because I also listen to a few non-marketing related podcasts that are like that I find are really kind of captivating and well done. So yeah, that's a really important step, because once you've got those key elements down, so the main topic you've chosen to cover, actual episode titles that you can start planning from, and then you've also got the format, then you can get to planning and you can then write your script if that's something that you need to do or want to do, or you can just start recording and see what comes to mind. So now that you've actually started planning your first couple of episodes, it's time to actually record your episodes. And this is probably the bit that most people are really intimidated by. And I completely understand that. I was really intimidated when it came to actually recording a podcast. I'd had some very brief experience with audio and broadcast communications with my degree and in the early stages of my marketing career. But there's a difference between bouncing off of someone else and it feeling like a natural conversation and getting used to actually sitting down and just basically having a conversation with yourself, except you're not having a conversation with yourself, you're having a conversation with your target audience. And to do this, you really need to find the equipment that's going to be best for you in the situation that you're in. So to give you some kind of context, I am married, I'm 26, and I'm not a property owner. I don't own my own home. I'm renting a flat. It's a basement flat, which we rented specifically so we could save money. And we rented it out just before the beginning of the pandemic, thinking that, hopefully we'd be able to get out a little bit. But for reasons and just because cost of living crisis and things like that, we've not been able to move. And we were thinking about moving a couple of weeks ago, but we just decided against it because we're still able to save money, even though our rent is going up just a tiny bit. But because I'm living in a basement flat, there's always noises going on around me. The walls are pretty paper thin, and that makes me very self-conscious, thinking about the fact that my neighbours could hear me. I can also hear what they're doing. So I'm sitting here a lot of the time recording and talking about marketing, wondering what are they thinking I'm doing or saying, but I don't think anyone really minds. And I literally just record using a software called Descript, which I highly recommend to anyone because of one specific factor. Actually, there's two specific factors. There's the transcript feature, which basically takes your audio and turns the audio into a transcript. And the second feature that's really good is the studio sound. So even if you record into your laptop and it sounds awful, if you use the studio sound feature, it will basically transform the quality of your audio. So you don't have to worry about necessarily the quality of your setup. It does it for you, which is really useful and a good thing for people who have never started a podcast before, because they're not going to know how to sort out sound issues. I've got a tiny bit of experience doing that, but it still makes my life very easy knowing that I can just record something for the most part into my computer and generally not have any sound issues. Now, I have had a few sound issues in the past couple of podcasts, and I think that's just a sign that I need to upgrade. But you don't need to upgrade or go out of your way to get a particularly expensive microphone. You could do, but ultimately you don't need to. And I think that it's not a good idea to upgrade and to immediately go out and spend money on equipment when you can do it right there and then on just your laptop and a free recording software. So I'm thinking of upgrading now because I've done this podcast for quite a while now and I know that I will continue to do it. So it's a good investment. But I was never going to go out and buy like a really expensive microphone in the beginning because I knew that I could just record it from my laptop and I wasn't sure how the podcast would go, whether I would actually enjoy the process of making a podcast. And so I didn't want to spend any money. And now I'm happy happy to upgrade to the higher tier version of Descript and maybe consider getting a microphone as well. But you don't need that. You just need either your laptop or your phone, and you need hopefully a quiet room. This is a little bit difficult for me just because, again, of my setup and the fact that I'm living in a flat with a bunch of other people. The flat is broken down like a townhouse, and we're on a street with a bunch of other townhouses too. So we're all kind of stuck together, and there's noises going on, and I can hear what's going on in the street above and the flat above me, and also my neighbours either side me. So it's a little bit tricky, but I normally just record the podcast in the middle of the day so that there's minimal noise possible. There's less people about. Sometimes like my neighbours upstairs and stuff, but the studio sound does typically remove any background interference that there might be. So the last couple of steps that you need to do in order to start your podcast is to learn how to actually edit audio and how to actually distribute your audio. And there's lots of different ways that you can approach this, but to simplify and make sure that this podcast episode doesn't go on for too long, I'm just going to give you a quick rundown of how I've done this. And so, like I said, I use Descript, and it has a transcript feature, which makes editing the podcast very easy because I can see all the ums and the ahs, and I can kind of delete them ahead of time whilst I'm still listening to audio. So that really speeds up the process. And then in doing that, I also need to know how to kind of slice it and make sure that the conversation sounds natural, because there's definitely breaking points and there's definitely things that I don't actually want to be featured in a podcast, but I've got my own editing style down now, and that just comes from experience. And then Descript also makes it really easy to just export and make a video into the audio. So I just add the media to the audio track, and then it transforms into a video, and I can share that either directly through Descript, or I can just export it and then upload it onto YouTube, which is what I do. But for a while, the podcast was on Spotify and the latest episodes aren't. But in the new year, I'm really hoping that I can upload the backlog of episodes, because I'm just a bit hesitant to kind of pay for an RSS feed right now when I can just do the podcast on YouTube, and that's a totally free resource. So that's mainly why I've just been holding back. And I think paying for an RSS feed, it seems a little bit, I guess, like I'm normally one who's pretty happy to pay for things on the internet. I understand that these are all resources, but at the end of the day, it's a service, but you're still having to actively go and do it. It's kind of like an open source thing, and I think that's why I'm a bit funny to kind of pay for it. So until I can find like a RSS provider who has like a relatively good price and actually has like, you know, a good amount of time so I can store enough episodes, then I will go and do that. But for now, I think the podcast is just going to be on YouTube. But for you, if it's really important for you to be on Spotify and on like Apple Podcasts and SoundCloud, then an RSS feed is probably going to be the way to go. And it's actually really simple to do. It seems like something that might be technically advanced, but there's so much information out there that kind of breaks it down, and anyone can go and do it. And then once you've done that, you've linked your podcast to an RSS feed, it will just automatically upload your episodes to your chosen platform, so like Spotify and Apple Podcasts. So you don't have to think about that. It's just automatically done. And then once you've actually uploaded those, then it's time to kind of promote your first couple of episodes, and you will notice that your first episodes get the most views or listens, and the listens will kind of drop off. But that's where, you know, again, promoting on social media, growing a following, maybe investing in paid ads to advertise your podcast really, really helps to ensure that you have a steady amount of listeners each month. So that's it. That's everything I had to share with you today. I really hope that this episode helps you on your podcast journey, so you can do what I've done and start creating a backlog of podcast episodes that you can use as awareness stage content to share your expertise and start to build trust with a engaged audience. If you do need help recording a podcast or editing and planning a podcast, we do offer those services as a full service service content marketing agency. So if you're a small business thinking about starting a podcast, but you just need a little bit of help getting started, then please do get in touch and we can talk about your project requirements. And as always, if you liked this episode, please like this video on YouTube and make sure to subscribe to our channel so that you can stay up to date with the podcast. And as always, I will speak to you next week. Thanks for listening. Bye.